The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
On the eve of the NHL trade deadline, Mikko Rantanen still available. And on your trade board, the number one trade target. CJ, what are you hearing about the Carolina Hurricanes forward?
Well, at some point here in the last couple days, Julian, this went from the Carolina Hurricanes listening to teams that were interested to them proactively, going out and seeing what might be out there for them with a potential Mikko Rantanen deal. And that really, in a nutshell, boils down to why he has surged to the top of the trade board at The Athletic, why, I think he's the biggest story, at least as we're recording now. I mean, today is the day of ultimate caveats. I'm not even going to bore you by throwing them out there, but just know that anything Julian or I say today could be rendered immediately, the opposite could be true, because we're now within 30 hours to the deadline and things start to move quickly. But, at 30 hours out from the deadline, Rantanen for me is the biggest story, because the Hurricanes have engaged with a number of teams, and they're the kind of teams that make big trades. So it maybe won't surprise you that the list that I've been told includes, it might not be in its entirety, the Dallas Stars, the Florida Panthers, and the Vegas Golden Knights are three teams that I've been told have at least engaged to some degree on Rantanen with Carolina. And, I know other teams like New Jersey, which I don't think makes sense just because they're in the same division, currently scheduled to play the Hurricanes in round one. Toronto, I believe, has at least gotten a sense of what that market looks like on Rantanen, but might not be as much of a fit for them. But at this point, Dallas, Florida, and Vegas, I think, are all teams that are looking to see if this is something they can do. And, you get to this close to the deadline, you get a name as big as Rantanen's, you get a situation as unique as this one, and you have teams like that stepping up. I mean, let's even go back a bit further, Julian. What makes Rantanen really, really unique? Okay, he's got 1.08 points per game in the regular season. He's got 1.25 points per game in the playoffs as an NHL player. Obviously won the Cup as part of that Colorado team in 2022. He's still only 28. Just not the type of player. You don't see a player that resume still in this stage of his career available often. And he doesn't have a big cap hit because half was already retained. He's at about $4.6 million right now with Carolina, and they have the ability to retain him down to $2.3 million. And so if we were ever going to have a discussion, and we might with other players on the board or other guys in your mind of, this team's trying to trade for this player. Well, then the next question is always, well, how are they going to fit him in? And maybe it doesn't work. Maybe this is a trade best served for the off season. Because obviously
a lot in the last few days.
Well, but it's also a fact, right? I mean, it's almost like a meme because it's true, but it's easier to make trades in the off season. Teams don't have the same cap pressures. You're actually allowed to go above the salary cap by 10% in the summertime. It's just easier to make deals involving money, not when the season's being played every day. But what makes this trade really, really, really unique is that, you can make this trade right now. And because, Rantanen, in addition to being a super player, also doesn't have much of a cap hit attached to him for the remainder of the season. So I think that brings teams in. I mean, look, Dallas is using LTI. They have Niels Lundqvist out for the season. There's some hope that Tyler Seguin, who has been on LTIR, will return during the year, so they would have to activate him. But they also have Miro Heiskanen is not expected to play for the rest of the year. So they have cap ability to do a trade like this. Florida, of course, has the Matthew Tkachuk situation where he's not expected back before the end of the regular season. I know they've already made moves, bringing in Vitek Vanacek on Wednesday as a goaltending depth, and obviously the Seth Jones trade over the weekend. But they can make this work. In Vegas, I don't even know if the cap applies there. I mean, they are so well run. And that's why I'm not suggesting, I should be very clear that they're cheat or anything like that, but they always find a way to make the cap space available. They're always in that position where they can add, and, they can make it go. And so that brings us to where we are now, just counting down the hours. But, my sense is there's a very real possibility that this is a move that happens. And, obviously for Carolina, they're going to be looking for real players or player or players back for Rantanen, because they're a playoff team in the Metro Division that suddenly seems kind of wide open. Maybe that's disrespecting Washington a bit, but you got the Jack Hughes injury in New Jersey. You got teams like the Rangers and Columbus pushing kind of at the back end. I mean, I don't know how that division is going to shake out this season, but there's a real opportunity there for Carolina, and obviously they're trying to seize it.
If you could put a percentage on the likelihood of Mikko Rantanen being traded, since you seem so sure, what percentage would you give it at?
Ooh. Well, I've asked a few people kind of in the industry that question, and one that was willing to bite on it on pretty late Wednesday night, basically early Thursday morning, said 80%. So I'm not going off my own, I didn't just put like a finger in the air and try to see which way the wind's blowing here. I mean, that's based on, people that are kind of, this person isn't directly involved, but sort of close enough that has some insight. So look, I could be wrong on that. It's funny. I did an outside podcast earlier this week, obviously before this development, or at least I was aware of this development. And they asked me, what are the odds he signs and what are the odds he stays through the deadline? And I was like 10% and 10%. Like I was basically, my point is, as recently as a few days ago, I've been recorded saying it's 10%. But there's definitely been a surge towards it becoming a deal. Now that doesn't, the point is you still have to get it across the finish line, right? I mean, it's one thing to exhaust all of the available information, to look through what those teams want, to see if there's a fit. Doesn't guarantee, obviously, that there's a fit. I think what we know of the Hurricanes' actions here, what they tell us is that they are truly very open to a trade if they can find one, but they still have to make the trade, right? And what's been hard, I think, for them is they made a significant offer to Rantanen, and obviously they made a big trade to get him on January 24th, and Rantanen hasn't closed the door, to my knowledge, to ever signing in Raleigh. I think it's more just, I'm not prepared to make that decision now. I think that they want to, see if they can recoup at least a good portion of those assets and move forward, because, they feel they put a pretty strong foot forward here in trying to sign him. And man, I mean, I don't think unless you have a player that is in your brain, I can't think of a situation like this one. Certainly not with a superstar player. I mean, we've seen players, acquired in season and reacquired. I mean, Vinny Desharnais just got traded for the second time this year, last night, going from Pittsburgh to San Jose after earlier in the season going from Vancouver to Pittsburgh. That happens, but not a player of this magnitude. And it really sets up for a dramatic final stretch here, pushed till the deadline on 3 p.m. Eastern on Friday.
The thing that intrigues me the most with a possible Mikko trade, it's what you mentioned earlier. Like, a player has to come back in this move. If you're Carolina, like, can you go into more detail about the type of hockey trade that has to happen for them to make this work?
Well, look, they have a player in Mikko Rantanen who they only have under contract through June 30th, right? So they only have the last 6 weeks of the regular season here and whatever playoff games guaranteed with him. And so, I think their thinking is, if he's not prepared to sign a 9-figure contract now, what are the odds he's likely to sign one on May 28th or June 28th? It's not a 0% chance. I mean, but I think that the feeling is they've only got him for that small window of time. So what you're looking back at primarily, I think, in a trade like this, is getting a player under control beyond that point. Now, it doesn't mean that player has to be under contract. Maybe the mystery player or players is a restricted free agent and you got to sign them this summer, but at least there's team control there. And so I think you're looking at players that are either signed beyond this season or have, team control beyond this season that are, obviously they have to be good players. I mean, you're not trading Mikko Rantanen for fourth liners. No. You're not, and as you astutely point out here, you're not probably trading him for first round picks unless you're Carolina and you can immediately flip those picks for a player or players that you would use now. I mean, it's not as though the Hurricanes are going into a rebuild here. We should be clear. Really what they're pursuing is the classic hockey trade. I think that they're looking for a deal that can maybe meet some of their needs, which is a bit more control with a player, a bit more certainty with a player, but also obviously a player or players that can help make their team better both now and beyond this season. Because really what they have with Rantanen is a player who can make them better or keep them at where they are, but they don't have them beyond this season. And so I think it's as simple as that to lay out verbally. I don't think that that's a simple fit to find, but you look at a team like Dallas, and I don't have the name or names for you. So I'm not even going to throw any out, but they have a lot of really good players in Dallas, right? There's a reason why they've been to back-to-back conference finals. They have both the younger players on the rise or maybe already there, but the younger players pushing up in their roster. They have established players that have been very good players in the league. I mean, they have drafted and developed so well, hit some home runs with picks that aren't just inside the top 10. And so you could imagine out of that group of players that there could be a fit. I also think if you're in Jim Nill's position, obviously you have the cap space to do this. You also have a team that's been to back-to-back conference finals, right? And so you're looking for every possible way to get that group over the top. And they've been dealt a tough hand this year. They've had a lot of injuries, especially on their blue line. They maybe haven't performed at any point this season where you're like, wow, that's a Stanley Cup favorite. But I think you look at the collection of guys there, why couldn't it happen? And what does a potential Rantanen deal do for that group? That's how you have to think. That's how these teams all do think. I mean, who has been more really aggressive than Vegas and Florida in the last few years?
I mean, Dallas has to be right up there. Jim Nill is a guy who is not quick to make trades, but he will make the right move when it comes time.
Right. And Vegas and Florida played in the 2023 Stanley Cup final. Mm-hmm. And obviously we know all about the Golden Knights DNA, but Bill Zito, ever since he took over the Panthers GM job, I mean, he has hit some absolute screaming home runs, but he's not afraid of the big deal. We haven't even mentioned Tampa's big deal. I mean, there's a lot going on around the league right now, and I'm sure we'll get there.
We're bouncing. Don't worry. I got that on the list. We've got a bunch of stuff to get to.
The reason Tampa came to mind, though, is Julian Brisebois is another GM known for the big deal. Now, I have not heard anything on Tampa and Rantanen, so I don't want to confuse the conversation too much. But, it's if this deal happens, I think it's fair to say the way the first deal, it came out of the blue, so that was part of the shock factor. But this deal, if it happens, maybe won't be quite as shocking because we're now onto the chase here a little bit. Those of us that make our livings texting and bugging people for a living, but it will still be. I think it'll be still a wow moment because it's probably going to involve something, obviously, that compels Carolina to move them. It's going to have to involve at least one player that I think you're like, wow, never saw Team X trading player Y.
For those reasons, that's why you know what? I think it's going to happen to Dallas. I think Dallas is going to find a way to get Rantanen. I think it's going to go that way. Also, I picked them to win the cup, so I kind of think you're not buying
into Vegas just always being the Death Star.
Vegas is always going to be the Death Star, but when you put it to the point where like a solid player has to come back, and Dallas has been just accumulating talent for the last how many years, they could really do this. I could see a world where they do this. That's my pick, and that's not me with intel. That's just me making a prediction off of the teams you've.
Where the vibes are at for you. That's where the vibes are at for me right now. The universe is pushing you in that direction. Hey, look at it's certainly a possibility. I know that they've been involved in talks, and as I mentioned, Carolina has had conversations with other GMs not attached to the teams I've mentioned here. Like, I think that they've done a pretty exhaustive preemptive search, just to see, I guess if you're making this decision, you really need to have all the information, right? Yeah. Like, what was the criticism of the Dallas Mavericks trade? In part, it was that they didn't fully exhaust the market, was the view in people in the NBA, that they dealt with the Lakers. They got it done sort of quick and dirty. But what did they leave out there on the table? I don't think we're going to, remember, Rantanen does have some amount of control here. He's got a limited no trade clause. So there are certain teams he could prevent a move to. But I think beyond that one little hurdle that the Hurricanes have to overcome, it's fair to say whether they trade him or don't trade him, that they will have all the information they will have needed to make that decision and what they believe is the best one for their organization.
Anything else on Rantanen before I move on to Brock Nelson?
No, let's move on. I'm too scared because you and I love to go long. I'm too scared we're going to go so long that any of this material will be outdated by the time the listener is getting into your favorite podcatcher. So I'm trying to be efficient today.
Brock Nelson, what are you hearing on him?
As of Thursday morning, believe it or not, no clear indication 100% that he is going to be traded.
Wow.
Now, he's still number 2 on the trade board, and he is number 1 in the hearts of a lot of teams and GMs out there in this trade market. There is tremendous interest in Brock Nelson. I think, you got to look at Winnipeg and Toronto as 2 possibilities. Colorado's another very good team trying to improve down the middle. They'd love to get their hands on him. The New Jersey Devils dealing with Jack Hughes, obviously done for the season, unfortunately, following his shoulder surgery on Wednesday. They would be there. That's on the exhaustive list. Now, Lou Lamoriello has had a lot of discussions, it sounds like, with Brock Nelson, with his agent. Hasn't given up, I suppose. It doesn't seem like I would say at this stage, an extension is likely by Friday for him with New York. But, I think working through what that might look like, how the offseason could go, maybe would Brock Nelson be open to that? And so, I don't want to race too far ahead. I've kind of shown my hand by putting him number 2 on the trade board. It still implies to me, I just think the Islanders situation is one where they have to really seriously consider where they're at. They do have an aging team. They've fallen to the tough end of the playoff chase. And yet I say that knowing, look, what is New Jersey going to be? I mean, there's opportunity for all those Metro teams I've already outlined. Maybe the Islanders see a chance still to get in there. But they have Brock Nelson and also Kyle Palmieri, pending UFA that hasn't got as much attention. But I think, 2 players that they could turn into a significant pile of assets and, move forward. So, where we're at with Nelson is, imagine a world that comes down to a Toronto and Winnipeg bidding war for this guy.
Ooh,
but
those 2 teams, why those 2 teams?
Well, because they're 2 teams that really need a centerman. I think Nelson is a perfect fit for the Jets. They're looking for even a number 2 centerman if they can get one. I think he fits the bill on that team. Minnesota boy. I think he'd embrace the opportunity of giving it to come and play for the Jets. Toronto, we've talked a lot about their center search. Well, what's happened since we've last recorded is that the center market has gotten smaller, right? Jake Evans signed his new deal in Montreal. Yanni Gourde is now again a member of the Tampa Bay Lightning. So he's off the board. Braden Shen, the St. Louis Blues pulled out a big shootout win Wednesday night in LA. They're 6-1-1 in their last 8 games. St. Louis was already asking a huge price for Shen. Can they move him in this environment where they've certainly got themselves back in the meat of the Western Conference playoff chase? And so, you're getting a little lower if you're the Leafs on options, but obviously Brock Nelson could be a big one. And yet I've started this whole segment saying I'm not sure he's being dealt. As of Thursday morning, it does not sound 100% as though, the Islanders are signaling to other teams or they've signaled to Brock Nelson himself that he will be traded, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because as I mentioned, the market is huge here. And if you haven't laid the groundwork, it's a big trade for the Islanders if they end up making it here. And so that's where it's at. I still have to believe that he's likely moved. Just the combination of his age, where the team is at in the standings, where they're at, kind of big picture with the roster that I think needs some youth invested in it. Obviously, Matt Barzal's been out. They're just it's not lining up for them to, even if they could squeak into the playoffs. What kind of playoff team are they going to be? This is a player that almost every other organization has long since been shopping around. Doesn't mean they would have made the deal by now, but they would have a sense of the market. That's not how Lou Lamoriello operates, but I just have to believe he's going to get there between now and the deadline on Friday.
So the Islanders, as we're talking, they're 4 points out of a playoff spot in the Eastern Conference. There's a whole bunch of other teams in a similar predicament. Thinking of the Boston Bruins, who they're probably going to be on the way down, but they still have an outside chance. The Canadiens are playing their best hockey. They've won 5 in a row. They're 2 points out. The Red Wings and the Rangers as well. The Islanders are very much in that cluster of teams where...
Do you know what we call that cluster?
Tell me what you call that cluster.
No man's land.
They're in no man's land, essentially, where they're close enough to make the playoffs, but also it could be done for them. What do you do?
Well, okay, so if you make the playoffs, and I'm not look at, you have an owner if you're a GM, and you answer to your owner, and your owner likes seeing money come into the business. So
100%.
It is at minimum 2 home playoff games if you make the playoffs. But if you're the Islanders, like reasonably, it's a climb to get into the playoffs. Like, are you winning a round? Are you winning 2 games in that series? I mean, I guess look at the Islanders are a team that have always been a bigger collection of the collective talent than they're not a one superstar kind of team, the we before me mentality. And so I guess I can't rule out that they are a hard out. They're the Finland of the Stanley Cup playoffs. You know what I mean? that they play in a way that, makes them more than the collection of who they are. But
I like that. I like that comparison. The Finland. I like that.
Right. And I say that with respect. I should be very clear. I mean, Finland, right. I just think Finland outkicks consistently in international tournaments where you would think they should finish is based on lining up the roster side by side. I don't know. I look at Lou Lamoriello there's a reason, like he's still in the GM past his 80th birthday. So obviously he's done something right over the years to remain employed, but it feels to me that if it's a huge risk. I mean, it's also a seller's market. Let's be clear. Like some teams in that cluster that I'm calling no man's land are going to have to sell assets, right? Because there's not enough teams that are way out of it to supply this whole market with the players needed. And so, how far is Pittsburgh out right now? Just for fun. I mean, Pittsburgh is a clear seller.
Oh yeah. Like, well, no, I want to get to them in a second.
No, but how far
they
made
a trade yesterday. They're like 9. Is my math right? 9 points out because they're 67 points. Well, Ottawa's 67. Pittsburgh is 58. They're 9 points out.
Okay, so I guess I was going to try to make the argument that like you could argue the Penguins might get hot and get in. 9 points is a lot to make up, but I'm just saying a lot of teams are in it on paper. But I think at this point of the season, more than 3/4 of the way, and you're defining what does in it mean. Like, yes, we might slip in on the last day of the regular season and then get our ass kicked in round 1. I mean, is that worth it? Man.
Some no man's lands are measured differently. Like the Ottawa Senators could make the playoffs and they might get beat in the first round. But for a franchise that hasn't made the playoffs since 2017, that would be seen as a step forward compared to New York Islanders, who has been used to some measure of playoff success the last how many years. Getting into the first round and then getting beat is not good enough. That is very true.
Yeah, you're right. And look, Detroit's in that spot. Columbus, obviously, like I'm
100%.
Getting in the playoffs, that means something. They're being fueled. You go down the list. One of my favorite things is sort the Columbus, point producers, and like they're the guys that are driving a lot of their successes here. Obviously, Werenski is at the top, and you got Sean Monahan in there, but then it's like age 23, 19, 22. Like that's a young team that's driving Columbus's success. So getting in the playoffs, I get why they want to. The Islanders are not that, right? The Islanders are not, they don't have a bunch of kids driving this. In fact, it's a very strange roster composition.
It absolutely is.
Anyway, I feel like I'm living too much in this point, but
all good.
Right, the news, the information is, as of right now, Brock Nelson isn't going to be moved. My takeaway is that if that remains the case, because they don't have another game to play either, right? Mm-hmm. They're out in California. They've played their last game before the deadline. If they don't move him, I would be it. I mean, look, it will be a decision, but we just saw Yanni Gordon, Oliver Bjorkstrand get 2 first-round picks, plus Mikey Eyssimont from Tampa. I just think in this market, there could be a lot out there for Nelson Palmieri trades. To say nothing if they went further down their own list and went, hey, do we move JG Pajot? Or because I just think that this market is so thin on players. There's just not enough of them. It's not to say the players are bad. What an opportunity for Lou Lamoriello, and let's see what he does with it.
Okay, Brock Boeser is 3rd on your trade board out in Vancouver. What say you on him?
So here's the thing with Boeser. Unless there's a complete about face, he's not signing an extension by Friday. We're talking about the Canucks' longest tenured player. One, they've had contract talks with his agent going way back into the season. There was the $8 million 5-year ask, and I've been told that that's basically about accurate. I don't know if it's exact. Not ask, offer earlier in the year. And so right now it looks like he's going to be an unrestricted free agent come July 1st. And so the Canucks certainly have gauged the interest on him, but what they're finding or what they've found is there's a lot of overlap here. You have Mikko Rantanen out there. that's a big scoring winger. Obviously he would be ahead of Boeser for teams looking for that kind of player. He's also cheaper right now because of the cap thing I mentioned. You've got Rakell in Pittsburgh, 29 goals. He's actually the top goal scorer this season on the trade board. He makes just $5 million. Now there's some complications there. He's got 3 years beyond this one on his contract, but he's a goal scoring winger. And so I think Boeser is kind of in that mix where the Canucks don't know how serious the interest is because some teams might be in on those guys. Would they pivot to Boeser? Is there enough there? All of which is to say, I don't know if he gets moved. But Vancouver's certainly willing to do it. And, I think that there's an argument that they should do it just because they are in no man's land. Mm-hmm. That cluster I've defined, trademark. They
love it.
They did come up with a win over Anaheim and played very well in the game on Wednesday. And it's hilarious. You get down to the deadline, you're literally reacting off games. I'm not saying management's making decisions off that, but you're gauging where the team is based on each night, what's happening on the ice. The Canucks right now, they're making decisions big picture. Their management, while they obviously hope they get in the playoffs for all the reasons we've mentioned, I don't think that they're going to do anything at this deadline that is about trying to push this team a little bit more towards the playoff, the positive side of the playoff line. I think that they're looking big picture. That's why they're listening on guys like Pius Suter and Derek Forbort, who are pending UFAs, and Brock Boeser falls into the category at the top, obviously, as another pending UFA. And so obviously they're not moving him for nothing because there is the present playoff chase, but he could be had if someone, gets motivated. And so, right now, I don't know how likely that is. It doesn't strike me as terribly likely, but this is where the caveat comes in that I think that there's room there depending what happens. I mean, there's a chance the Penguins don't move Rakell, by the way, and he's pretty high on the list at this point. But I think it's a different calculation for Pittsburgh, but what they're looking at is, okay, so he is signed for 3 years beyond this year. He's having a outrageously good season, like on pace for 35 plus goals. Maybe this summer he's worth more. Now I'm talking about Rakell, because what we're going to have this summer is a cap that jumps all the way up to $95 million. The price for a winger that can score 25 goals might be more than $5 million, let alone one that just scored 35 goals. And so in the rising cap environment, when you can involve more teams, because there's certainly been a lot of interest in Rakell, I think the Penguins have to determine, is it worth just moving him now, taking, whatever offer ends up being the best one on the table, or do they hold him back and do that in the summer? I think the Penguins haven't made, certainly as of this recording, I don't think that they've made that decision one way or another definitively. So that's where the goal scoring wingers are at. As I mentioned, I think Rantanen is more likely than not at this stage to be moved. Rakell kind of could go either way. So we'll see if maybe those dominoes fall that there's a team that steps up and gets Boeser. But, that's where it's at right now. Otherwise, the Canucks are looking to do some bigger picture things. I know it's been out there that they wouldn't mind a speedy center. I'm not sure they feel that that's a need that needs to actually be addressed right now. I mean, they'd love it. Obviously, it's on the wish list, maybe bigger term, longer term. But it could be, it's an interesting deadline. Like the Canucks are one of the teams that truly could buy and sell at this deadline, depending how some things fall. But at this point, we just don't know exactly what direction it's going, other than to say Boeser very much available.
As of right now, the Canucks tied on points with the Calgary Flames. Tied on points with the Flames are in the second wild card position. You would say they're in that no man's land you were talking about too. St. Louis is there. Utah is there. Utah signing a bunch of guys. You've been saying it from time that Utah looked as if they were going to be a team that was just going to keep some guys and try to stock up ahead of a playoff push, and they're within a couple points too.
Well, quick note on them. I mean, they had 8 UFAs as of a week ago. They've now signed 4 of them, right? Vejmelka, the goaltender, got a 5-year deal, $4.75 million. They signed Ole Mata to a 3-year contract a couple days ago. They've added Ian Cole and Alex Kerfoot. So there's 4 names right off the list. Still curious what happens with Nick Bjugstad. Because he's a center that's in some amount of demand, right shot, kills penalties, good in the faceoff dot. They've traded him in the past to Arizona. When they were Arizona, they dealt him to Edmonton a couple years ago, got Michael Kesselring in a pick back, and then signed him back in the offseason. The fact he hasn't signed an extension, just one to monitor. But in general, Utah has taken the posture that they don't need more 4th round picks. What they need is building a team identity. They're in a new market, and they want all hands on deck, I think, for their own push to play meaningful games. I don't know if they'll get to the playoffs. Can't rule it out. They're in no man's land, but they're not far out. And, obviously those players like the setting there. I think that's another takeaway from those set of, signings. Some of those guys Kerfoot took a 1-year deal. He gets paid okay, $3 million, nothing to scoff at. But I think you could formulate an argument that hitting the open market, he might have done better for himself just in pure financial terms. But, he wanted to stay. So, I think they feel like they're building something in Utah and they had an opportunity to do a whole bunch of deadline. They could have been one of the stars of the deadline, selling all those players, but instead they're going the direction that I've kind of felt for the last month or so that they'd be headed in.
And that I understand because they're so close to the playoffs, because of the fact that they're, in their first year in a new market. I totally understand them signing players and possibly even being a buyer. To get back to another team we mentioned a little earlier.
I've heard that mentioned, by the way, as a Rakell suitor.
Interesting.
So not saying I've heard LA, Utah, among teams that are in on Rakell. LA wants a scoring forward. LA was part of conversations with Rantanen. I just think they backed off at a certain point. But, they'd love to inject something into their lineup that, helps them have a little more offensive punch. I mean, look, they could be going for their 4th straight year playing Edmonton in round 1.
Oh my God.
Which has been a tough draw because they're 0 for 3 and the series, if you look at them, they keep ending quicker. So they're more decisive as things have gone along. And so, LA would like to get some scoring help. And one name I know that they've inquired on is Rakell, in addition to Rantanen. Let's see what happens in LA because Edmonton, I don't even know if we'll get to Edmonton on this pod, but it's not been going well.
No.
Obviously, they're looking for help on their blue line ahead of the deadline. They've really stumbled out of the Four Nations break. And the team's defensive play has been left wanting. And so maybe they're more gettable too, right? If you're in LA, you're looking at that thinking maybe this sort of trade could help get us over the top.
Yeah, as Edmonton, at least 7 losses in the last 10 games. It's like just with Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl instead, not instead, but in their steed, you need to do something if you're the Edmonton Oilers to make them better. You need to do something. We don't even need to spend an entire segment on that. I'm very curious about what they're going to do at this deadline.
Yeah, I still don't think they're getting a goalie though. Just
no,
because that is the evergreen question at Edmonton. Get a goalie? My understanding is it's still no.
Okay, I wanted to get to Pittsburgh because I'm very intrigued about the fact that a guy like Rakell could be had at the deadline, but they went out and got Tommy Novak and Luke Schenn in that trade they made with Nashville that sent Michael Bunting and a draft pick the other way. And we've established already how far down the Pittsburgh Penguins are in the standings. What's the thinking with this trade? What's the thinking with the Penguins ahead of the deadline?
Well, Tommy Novak ticks a lot of boxes for them. He is a younger player than Michael Bunting. He's a cheaper player than Michael Bunting. May not be a point producer to the degree Bunting has been, but, can do some other aspects of the game that I think the Penguins value. Luke Schenn is, they also got a pick. And then right. Luke Schenn is what makes it interesting because, there's certainly a world where Luke Schenn is flipped by Pittsburgh before Friday's deadline. If not before Friday, he's under contract through next season. So he's an asset that can be traded. And obviously Kyle Dubas has a history with him, having traded for him in Toronto at the 2023 deadline. The Penguins are comfortable keeping Luke Schenn if that's what it comes to. And as of the time they made that trade, there was no other, they hadn't surveyed the market on him, if you know what I'm saying. They didn't know what else was out there. So that's why he wasn't immediately flipped. But, he's an asset that he goes right on the trade board somewhere in the teens. Actually paired up with his brother Braden. That was a little cheekiness from CJ as I was putting together the latest trade board. Yeah, I think Luke Schenn to the Penguins is the perfect kind of asset because he's a player. If he ends up being a player that they're more than happy to have, and they think he'll be an additive member of their locker room. But, let's face it, it's a pretty thin defense market at this deadline. I think that they're going to see what they can get. And what I should underline here is the Penguins, while they're looking for futures, Julian, they've not prioritized picks. They actually want players. And we've seen them trade for a number of players. Tomasino earlier in the year from Nashville. That's what they've got here in Tommy Nowak. I mean, I think that they want players that can jump in a lineup right now, because that's how they want to boost their rebuild. It's not about just drafting a whole bunch of guys and waiting 3 to 5 years until they marinate and then we have a good team. They're trying to do this urgently. And the way you do that is by finding, I don't even know if you call it a diamond in the rough, but maybe a player that's ready to take the next step now. And so that's why they make a trade like this one. They just get younger, as I mentioned, on Bunting, and they get these other things that can turn into other things. And we haven't seen a team, I don't think, I'm at risk of forgetting someone, but I don't feel like we've seen a team attempt to rebuild in this manner. Now, that might just be due to the fact we haven't seen a team with like 3 Hall of Famers still relatively productive, and certainly the main Hall of Famer being Sidney Crosby still 100% productive for this team. We haven't seen a team with like these legacy players that they're trying to catch them back on the upswing, essentially. And so it might be a unique rebuild because it's such a unique situation. But that's kind of the rationale you have to, when you're looking at this trade, you have to look at, and any trade Pittsburgh makes is, they're trying to bring in players that can play right now. They're not just trading for future hopes. I mean, obviously you still got to get picks, and those picks could be flipped for future players, right? They got to pick back for Desharnais, who they took in the Vancouver deal earlier in the year. They got to pick Novak. Like those are players maybe you draft, but they could also be, they're getting like 2027 and 2028 picks. Those kids are in grade 9 or whatever that are eventually going to be drafted so I'm just saying those could be used in a lot of ways. So where's Pittsburgh at? They're still going to look to move Anthony Beauvillier, who's a pending UFA. They have Matt Grzelcyk, left shot D, who's a pending UFA. I think both those players are possibilities to be moved. And then we can add Luke Shen to the list of Penguins who may find a new home before the deadline.
I still think Anthony Beauvillier in Ottawa makes sense.
He's been pretty productive this year. Like for how he's used and deployed, I'm just saying, relatively speaking, I think he's got 12 even strength goals. One of those, if he's well traveled too, which, sometimes might change how you view things, but it won't be a big headline if he's moved. But I think he's one of those, could be a sneaky good ad for a team.
Like 1.25 mil on the cap, can score goals, producing. I didn't mean to insert the Ottawa Senators into this conversation, but as a team that's
You're always doing that, Julian.
Yeah, terrible.
How does this affect the Senators? That's how you think. You're counterculture to the how does this affect the Leafs meme.
Senators representation. I just think with this team, obviously the fact that they don't have a ton of salary cap space, I think right now it's at $850K. Look, they have to go cheap unless they're willing to part with a body on the roster to make something work. And a guy like Anthony Beauvillier, if they could find a way to clear some other space somewhere, makes a lot of sense. I also wrote about Ryan Donato making a lot of sense, even though he costs a little bit more. But as I expect, he's going to have a lot of attention around him ahead of the Friday trade deadline. Dude's having a monster season.
I'm not ignoring you. My phone is ringing.
No. For those watching, and for
just want you to know it.
No, I appreciate that. For those watching and for those listening, it's going to happen. It's happened already, where CJ is going to check the phone. We all know, if you've been around the show long enough, you know that's a good thing around here. Normally it's impolite whenever you have to check your phone when someone's talking to you. But when you're dealing with an insider who could be on the verge of coming across some big news, that's a good thing for us here. So don't mind Siege as he checks his cell phone for what could possibly be the latest and greatest news that we could be talking about here on the pod. When you get a moment, Siege, just to round out the top 5 of your trade board, Scott Laughton out in Philadelphia. Like, it seems as if like that could be pretty pricey if a deal could be consummated, just considering what the market is looking like right now and some of the players available. Like, are we really out here looking to throw out a first round pick for Scott Laughton? Great player, but really, is he that expensive?
Well, look, that's where the price has been set and it hasn't been met yet. So, I think that's the best way to answer that. Let's see when more chips start falling, right? Mm-hmm. When we get some clarity on Brock Nelson, either he's moved to a team or 100% it's known he can't be had by trade. When there's a definitive answer on Braden Shen, like, is he an option for a team like Toronto? If he's not, then Scott Laughton becomes a plan B or C type of option, I think, for a lot of teams. But certainly there's a lot of interest in him. You know, it's not just like you call him up on Hockey DB and you do the math and you're like, okay, probably about a 35 to 40 point player historically. But he's more than that, right? Like he's from what I've heard, one of the most popular guys in the Flyers room. I mean, even that Last Supper picture, and I know he's clapping back at the trade talk, but like it kind of tells you like he's a beauty, right? Like that was pretty hilarious.
That was it was hilarious, but it was also a really cool photo.
It was like super well done. Like they didn't just like half-ass that, right? Like there was some thought put into that. And that thing went viral. And so he's a glue guy. He's a penalty killer. I do think there's a world that maybe it's not a first round pick, but it's an equivalent to a first round pick, maybe a highly ranked prospect, something like that. But you know, there's enough interest there. And it's at this point, there's almost more people shopping for centers than centers available. Mm-hmm. I don't think we can rule out the possibility that maybe they get that asking price. Maybe it ends up a hair below that. Maybe it's a first, but there's retention, you know, like, or there's a second and a pretty good prospect. Like there's sometimes different ways to get to the end goal. But yeah, I look, Laughton, there's a reason why he's been in the top 10 for a long time here on the trade board. There's huge interest in him. I think Philly obviously still in a bit of a selling mode before the upswing. And, you know, he's 30 years old. As much as they love the guy and they're comfortable keeping him, you know, I hate to even put this in the universe, but if Scott Laughton isn't traded at this deadline, he's then down to his last year of his contract. He's probably going to be right back on the trade board because there is that much interest in him. So, you wonder almost for him and his family and for his Last Supper photo. Maybe it's best if this is the end of his time in Philly, because I don't think any of this trade talk's going away, even if he isn't moved in the next 30 hours.
I need you to empty the notebook, Siege. Anyone else that's being very buzzy in terms of names on your trade board?
You know, name I'm watching now is Mario Ferraro in San Jose. He's under contract one more year, left shot D. You know, if you look at his numbers, they don't look good, right? He's been playing for the Sharks. That team is not set up to make a goalie look good or a defenseman look good. They are, their goal differential is in Masters territory with all the players with the minuses there. But, Ferraro's an interesting name that's bouncing around out there. You know, Brian Dumoulin, the Ducks kind of have a decision. I know they're in their own no man's land, but like the teams we mentioned in the East, they haven't been in the playoffs in a long, long time. I don't know if they can quite get there, but Dumoulin has attracted a fair amount of attention from the Ducks, and they have a decision. You know, the Ducks aren't like big S sellers, but do they sell that one particular player? You know, really, it's not a deep market on the blue line. It's kind of a tough call. You know, I wonder where Montreal goes. You know, they re-signed Jake Evans, as I mentioned. Pretty crazy story. He told reporters he had his whole house packed up. Like he was ready to move. And then, you know, had it sort of a second thought and basically ended up taking the Canadiens offer. You know, don't mess with Happy. I totally respect that, but like you can imagine the emotions he and anyone that cares about him have gone through in the last little couple weeks. Cause again, living life on a trade board isn't always fun. And in the rumors, especially in a market like that, but you know, they still have Yoel Armia and David Savard both out there. You know, the feeling is they're not going to trade both of those players, that it might be too big of a kill shot to their hopes of getting in the playoffs, but you could still see them moving one. Where do they go? And so I mentioned that as a long way of getting to Savard. Right shot D, who's on expiring deal, won a cup already in Tampa, clearly slowed down. Anyone who's watched him play, you know, the Canadiens still ask him to play a lot of minutes in some games and situations, but, you know, isn't the player he has been, but, you know, I think there could be a team out there that wonders, could he be the player we need him to be for the next, you know, 2 months? So that the Canadiens will have a decision there. I mean, with so many teams in what I'm calling the no man's land, Julian, like this is where this last little window in the run up to the deadline gets interesting because you can make cases to go either way. You know, we didn't even mention Buffalo here. They signed Jordan Greenway to a 2-year extension, $4 million. That one surprised me just because I know there was legit interest in him. Greenway, you know, you did think at this stage of his career, I mean, what is Buffalo thinking? Like, why not? But, you know, clearly they're not of a mind to just tear things down. And you know, a lot of the players in Buffalo being discussed are still their bigger pieces that it's got to be a hockey trade, for lack of a better phrase. Whether you're looking at Byram, Cousins, Alex Tuck. I mean, those are some of the names still being discussed, but those are hard deals to make, and they get increasingly harder as the clock ticks down towards the deadline. They do also have Jason Zucker as a pending UFA that, they've made some overtures to sign, so he might still get his own extension here at the deadline. But if he doesn't, I would think he'll be moved on. I'm going off adrenaline, man. I'm probably missing somebody out there.
I mean, the Calgary Flames potentially being buyers. I mentioned some of the teams in that no man's land out west. If there's some teams that are looking to sell, Calgary could take advantage of that.
Well, you lived this with them last year. They had such a tumultuous season last year, traded away a lot of players, obviously had UFAs that hung over their season. I don't think they want to be in that. I think they want to settle things this season and give the players credit. They've played well enough and won enough games that Craig Conroy and the management staff are in a spot where they don't have to do anything. And I think if a center fell in Calgary's lap, they would make that trade. But we just can't connect them to the main names on this board because they're not out there looking to move a first round pick, or they're not looking for the headline on deadline day. I think they're obviously open to adding a little bit to the team if they can. The other headline they're not going to make is Rasmus Andersson, who they've received a lot of interest in, going back a long time, but even until recently, their right shot defenseman, he's one more year on his deal. They're going to deal with his future this offseason. So he won't be moved at this deadline unless, I guess with the caveat, unless someone offers something so good they can't refuse, but it doesn't feel like it's heading in that direction. I mean, that's where we're at, man. We didn't even get to Tampa. Maybe a good place to end though, honestly. What
about New Jersey? Oh, before we get to Tampa, what about New Jersey? The fact that Jack Hughes is out for the year, and they're looking like a carcass that could get picked out. They're still in a playoff spot.
They are not a carcass in their own eyes. They are going to make an addition. Like they're not waving the white flag on the season, even though that's about as bad a news as you can get. Your leading scorer, second straight year his season's been ended by a shoulder injury and surgery, not going to be available until training camp, meaning even if somehow they go on this Cinderella run to the Cup final, it doesn't sound like he's even a possibility. So, I think that they're still going to make a deal and try to get this group in. I mean, they've put some points in the bank. They've got a little bit of a cushion, but it's not a big one. I mean, there's enough pursuers there that they still need to win games. That they lost Dougie Hamilton in their last game to an injury. That's not as severe, obviously, as Hughes. I think more of a week-to-week thing, but you start to add it up. They don't look like a team that's going to go on a long playoff run just because the injuries have stacked up. But they're still looking for a forward or someone who can help them down the middle. So, that I still expect them to be a buyer, but it's maybe with a little less enthusiasm when you don't have a full complement. Which brings us to Tampa.
Let's get to Tampa.
And I only want to characterize it this way: is there a better GM in the league than Julian Brisebois?
I don't think so.
I mean, look, you might say Kelly McCrimmon, you might say Bill Zito. I mean, look, start pointing at Jim Nill has got a lot of love when we did 100%. The anonymous front office poll that I did at the start of this regular season. But, I admire the way Julian Brisebois does business. 7 first-round picks I think he's traded now in recent memory for players in season or at the deadline that he's identified can help their team. Some of those players like Blake Coleman, Barclay Goodrow, helped to win a Stanley Cup, 2 of them, back-to-back years, 2020, 2021. They got to the final again in 2022. They haven't always worked out. They unloaded the 5 picks sort of famously for Tanner Jeannot.
Yeah.
And, after a couple years of that experiment, Tampa moved on. Like no GM is going to have all hits. What I love is how resolute Julian is in his decisions. And, even the Stamkos call last offseason was a difficult one, but they also made a trade to bring Ryan McDonough back. That was a hard decision they had made a couple years prior when the cap was flat and they were worried about, what that might do to their cap picture. They had to trade, days after that third straight final. Julian had to get, McDonough to sign off on a deal because he had trade protection at the time. They bring him back. They let Steven Stamkos walk. I mean, man, hard decisions. And as much as it's a kind of a feel-good story, Yanni Gourde's someone obviously they're comfortable with getting him back from Seattle. Oliver Bjorkstrand has one more year on his contract. Very useful player, 50-plus point guy. You can just see them rebuilding the third line in real time, right? Like that's what it feels like to me. I mean, I don't know exactly how John Cooper is going to use these guys, but it seems like they're pulling a little bit from their old playbook. With Jake Gensel now on board, like they've made some real changes around the core guys, right? They have a Point, a Kucherov, a Vasilevsky, a Hedman. They have the four horsemen there, but they're doing everything they can to give that group of players at least one more shot at chasing a cup. And so I tip my cap to them, Julian, because it's not easy for any GM making these decisions. Obviously, they're scrutinized in real time. You got a lot of people looking over your shoulder, but I think Julian Brisebois does a great job of he runs his own race. He's not looking in the other lane. He's not looking in the car beside him, trying to see what they're doing. He's makes decisions. He gets ahead of the market. Frankly, a lot of people think he pays too much, but yeah. I don't know if you can pay enough when you're putting banners in your building.
I mean, the first round picks for Bjorkstrand and Gourde, if this was a mid-level team, I'd be a lot more shocked. This is a team that is expected to compete for the Stanley Cup almost every year they're in it. So the first round picks for them, I wouldn't stress that as much for this team. I get where they're at with their best players getting older and older, but I don't stress those first round picks going away for those types of players.
I hope Julian Brisebois runs this team for the next 20 years because he's so smart and again, I'm really hyping him up, but I'm just, I really believe this. He's great at trading all these picks. I think he'd be good at a rebuild too. Like, I think he would make a plan and stick to it when it's time, when Tampa gets to the point where they're not going to be in that competitive window anymore. And so, he could be the kind of GM. Look, they do things different down there. John Cooper has been their head coach since the 2012-13 season. They've had such a sustained run of success. I could see a world where if that's what Julian wants to do, that he runs the team for a long time and sees it through to the next era. But, the 2026 and 2027 first round pick they traded to Seattle, that does not mean shit. If you're Braden Point, Victor Hedman. I mean, those guys, even if you made a great draft at that position, the player just would not be an impactful NHLer while those players are still relevant to the Lightning. So, those are top 10 protected picks. Julian, there's a world they fall 26 to 32. Mm-hmm. Not all first rounders. They all get reported the day the trade's made as a first rounder, but they're not created equal. And, the Lightning value players over promises, over magic beans. And, look at it. I don't know that anyone can necessarily replicate what they've done, but if you're looking at coming up with your own program or how to behave, I think you could do worse than copy the Lightning model.
I'm going to consider your hat tip to Julian Brisebois as your stick tap for this week. And I will give my stick tap to the city of Chicago for being amazing. This is like one of the best cities you could visit on the NHL circuit. I had never been before this week, and I can't say enough good things about this city.
Can't believe you've never been.
Yeah,
but I'm glad you got there because you'll go back. I mean, honestly, I'm not joking or exaggerating. I've probably been to Chicago 100 times.
Oh my God.
I've been multiple times on personal trips, like not where it's work stuff. And then obviously having covered the Blackhawks during their glory years, I've been at outdoor games there, a draft there, 3 Stanley Cup finals there. Anyway, I love it, but I'm with you. I ran the Chicago Marathon twice. There's a fun fact.
Nice.
That was my first ever full marathon way back in 2009 or 10.
Wow.
So
2009 or 10.
Yeah. I had a friend that actually, she got married quite young in her early 20s that I grew up with. She married a guy from Chicago, and I went in university. Like I first visited Chicago when I was staying in a youth hostel, and I'm a long way from staying in youth hostels nowadays. So that's how long I've been going to Chicago.
I can't wait to read the Chris Johnston memoir when you eventually decide to do it.
I don't even say this as a flex, but I've stayed at both a youth hostel in Chicago and the Ritz-Carlton. So I have run the gamut of potentials in Chicago.
Dog, all over the place, and we love it. Great work as always on the pod. Great work as always on The Athletic. We will have a post-trade deadline show.
Saturday.
And also be sure to check out Siege on TSN for Trade Center, where he will provide all the details and all the trades you need to know about for sure. Siege, enjoy the rest of your week, and good luck on Friday.
Travel safe, pal. You're the best. This was fun today. I love when there's a lot going on. And I would be lying if I didn't say a little part of me is thinking about Sunday when I'm on my way to Mexico.
Enjoy Mexico. But let's get to Friday and Saturday first.
We're almost there.
Peace, guys.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.